I don't know about you, but on Easter morning, I look forward to hearing the call and response of the congregation. He is risen. He is risen indeed. But on this first Easter morning, these ladies that were going to the tomb were not expecting a joyful, triumphant occurrence. They were grieving the loss of Jesus. And I want us to take the time this morning to look at their experience and see how it might impact ours. The women who came to the tomb that morning were faithful followers of Jesus. They had traveled from Galilee to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. They were expecting a joyous time. And in the end, they were there for the tragedy of Jesus' death. These women who had followed Jesus were there as he walked up the road towards the cross. They were there as he hung on the cross, hearing his last word, hearing him say, my God, why have you forsaken me? And hearing him say, it is finished. And they lingered there at the cross, I'm sure disturbed by the events that they witnessed, shaken to the core maybe. And while they were lingering there, they saw Joseph of Arimathea come and take down the body of Jesus. And they observed as he carried him away and took him to the tomb. And they watched as he was placed in the tomb. And that evening, as they left, they went together and they prepared spices for the burial of Jesus. But the next day was the Passover. They couldn't go and care for Jesus' body in the way that they wanted. They had to wait. And I'm sure they were grieving. I doubt they ate much. I doubt they slept much. I bet they shared their shock at what they had seen, at what had happened. I bet they were disturbed. I bet they hurt. I bet they physically ached. And so it wasn't that hard for them to get up early on that Easter morning. It's hard for us when we do sunrise services because we're disrupting our comfort. But they were in turmoil. And again, they probably hadn't slept much at all. And they gathered together and they carried their spices. And on the way, in the Gospel of John, we're told they wondered who would roll the stone away from the tomb. And this was the mindset they were in as they approached the tomb. They were wondering about the stone. They were wondering about the body. They weren't expecting an empty tomb. Imagine the women's surprise when they got to the tomb and the stone was rolled away. And think about what it must have been like as they curiously entered into the tomb, expecting to find the body and finding it empty. The Bible tells us, Luke tells us, that they were perplexed. And in that moment of being perplexed, men appeared, dazzling in their appearance. We would say, and probably correctly, that they were angels, messengers sent by God to speak to these women in their grief and confusion. The messenger's words to these women were probably the most startling you would ever expect to hear at the side of a grave. Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. And they go on to remind the ladies of the words that Jesus spoke. How he told them when he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and on the third day rise. And it says, and then the women remembered his words. Some might fault the ladies or even the disciples for not remembering Jesus' words. But I want us to think about the reality of the moment. They were viewing these experiences from the life lens that they had of how life worked. From what they knew from their education, what they knew from their life experience, what their culture taught them, what their religious traditions taught them. And they were just trying to cope with the death of Jesus in the way that made sense to them. They expected him to be in the tomb. They loved him and they wanted to honor him. And they did it the way that you would do that in that culture. They made the spices and they had to wait for the Passover. And they sat and they waited. And then they came to the tomb ready to treat Jesus as honorably as they could. That was the world they knew. And into that moment, those messengers from God spoke life into these ladies' grief. And I want us to think about that for a moment. Think about what would have happened if God hadn't sent those messengers in those ladies' grief and being perplexed. Think of the stories that they might have thought up to fit the narrative of what was happening in front of them. An empty tomb, a conspiracy, the government, the disciples, somebody doing something. And how confused and messed up that would be. But God knew those ladies' need. They needed to be reminded of the promise of God, and they needed to understand the reality of what was going on. And I think right now in our world, we need to be reminded of the promise of God. That He is always with us. That He walks with us through the challenges of life. That He is able to bear us when we are too weak to get through. That His strength is greater than anything that comes into our life. And so the messengers spoke into the lady's life. He reminded them of the promise, that which God had spoken, that which Jesus had spoken to them beforehand. But they also explained the reality of what was going on, and they told them what God was doing. That He is not dead. He is living. He has risen. And so there were two pieces, I think, that God used to bring healing, well, maybe three pieces God used to bring healing into these ladies' lives. First, He sent someone to speak into their grief in that moment, in their confusion. And then He reminded them of God's promises, of God's word, of what He said. And He spoke the reality of what God is doing into the situation. And so as we go through this difficult time in our nation, I think it's a time where we need to remember that it's important for people to be there to speak into people's lives. And that as followers of Jesus, who have the hope of the resurrection, giving us vision and purpose and confidence in this life, we need to be the people that speak God's words into people's lives. And we need to remind one another and those we come into contact with of the promises of God. That we will never be forsaken. That there has been a resurrection. That there is an empty tomb. And that there is hope for the future. That these trials that we're going through will pass by. Because God has promised that He will lead us through these things. But also we need to be reminded of the reality situation. And I want us to think about these women. All that was in their mind was that Jesus was dead. All they were focused on was the negative in that moment and just how they could cope with it. What they needed to be focused on was life, that Jesus was alive. And I think, too, in our circumstances, we're too focused right now on death, on the negative, on everything that's going wrong. And we need to be reminded that even in this difficult time in our nation, in our individual lives, in our world, that God is at work doing good things. That there are people reaching out in love, that lives are being changed, that God is making a difference even in the midst of this darkness. And that's what the resurrection and Easter morning is all about. Victory over death. Victory over sin. Victory over the tragedies in our lives. And great hope for the future. And the ladies' focus was completely changed. After they saw these messengers at the tomb, they went on to speak to others and share what they had heard and what they had learned and how their perspective had been changed. And that message was not received by everyone well. Some thought it was just idle chat. But it made an impact on Peter. And we know from other accounts, John, that they went to the tomb and they looked in and they marveled because they understood that Jesus had spoken was coming true, that He was alive and that there was hope. And so in this midst of this season, I pray that on this Resurrection Sunday, you will be filled with hope because you know that God is at work, that Jesus lives, and that we have a great future coming. And on this Easter morning, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.